You have felt this before, haven't you? This pulling backward through time, this sense that somewhere in the deepest chambers of your being lies a boy who knew things you have forgotten. Tonight, as consciousness begins its ancient dance with darkness, let yourself remember what it was to wake not in this world of glass and steel, but in another, where the morning mist carried whispers of angels and the stones beneath bare feet held the warmth of prayers spoken in tongues that predate your own. Close your eyes now and feel the pull of 7 centuries dissolving like salt in sacred water. Feel yourself becoming smaller, younger, simpler, yet somehow more complete than you have been in lifetimes. The year is 1350, and somewhere in the rolling hills between heaven and earth, a shepherd boy opens his eyes to a world that pulses with mysteries your modern mind can barely contain. This is not a story. This is a remembering. And in the space between your heartbeats, between the last thought of today and the first dream of tomorrow, you are about to discover what your soul already knows, that some awakening comes not from moving forward, but from returning to what you have always been. The boy wakes as boys have always awakened, not to alarm or urgency, but to the gentle insistence of light pressing through the wool blanket that separates sleep from the world. But this morning carries something different, something that makes his small hands tremble as they push away the rough fabric his mother wove by firelight during the long winter nights. The light itself seems older somehow, weighted with knowledge that makes the air shimmer like water disturbed by stones thrown from great heights. His name is Thomas, though he does not yet understand that names are prisons we build for souls that were meant to fly. 7 years have passed since his first breath in this world, 7 turns of seasons that have taught him the language of sheep and sky, of wind through barley, and the way morning dew holds tiny mirrors to heaven. But on this morning that feels suspended between 2 eternities, Thomas wakes not just to light, but to a calling that has no sound, a summons that speaks in frequencies older than human words. The cottage breathes around him, timber and thatch settling into the rhythm of dawn, the way a sleeping giant might shift in dreams too vast for mortal comprehension. His mother moves in the kitchen beyond the thin wall, her movements creating a percussion of earthenware and iron that has marked every morning of his existence. Yet today, even these familiar sounds seem layered with meaning, as if each clatter of bowl against wooden table, each scrape of knife against bread, were notes in a symphony composed before the first star learned to sing. Thomas sits up slowly, his bare feet finding the packed earth floor that generations of his bloodline have worn smooth with their passage. The ground beneath his toes pulses, not with his own heartbeat, but with something deeper, something that connects this small cottage to the vast network of stone and root and flowing water that binds all things in invisible embrace. He has felt this before, in dreams that come not from his own small experience, but from somewhere older, somewhere that remembers when the world was young and angels walked openly among the flocks. Through the single window cut into the wall, he can see his father's sheep scattered across the hillside like prayers made visible, their wool catching morning light and holding it the way souls catch grace, and transform it into something both earthly and divine. But today, the sheep seem different too, more aware, more present, as if they too have awakened into a world where the boundary between the seen and unseen has grown thin as spider silk. The boy moves to the window, his child's body carrying itself with an odd solemnity, as if some ancient part of him recognizes the significance of this moment. His reflection in the crude glass shows him a face he has seen countless times, yet today it seems to belong to someone else, someone older, someone who has witnessed things that 7-year-old Thomas should not remember, should not know, should not carry, in the depths of his dark eyes like secrets passed down through bloodlines that predate recorded time. Beyond the sheep, beyond the familiar contours of hill and valley that have circumscribed his entire universe, something moves in the morning mist, not walking, not flying, but moving in a way that suggests both and neither, a presence that exists in the spaces between solid and spirit, between here and elsewhere. Thomas watches with the peculiar stillness that children possess when they encounter mysteries that adults have trained themselves not to see, his breath fogging the glass as if his very life force recognizes a kinship with whatever approaches through the silver-grey veils of dawn. The air outside shimmers, not with heat, for the morning is cool with spring's tentative blessing, but with something that makes the landscape appear to breathe, to pulse with life that extends beyond the simple existence of grass and tree and stone. The hills themselves seem to be awakening, as if the earth is remembering dreams it dreamed when it was young, when the stories that would later become myths and legends were simple truths spoken around fires that burned with flame that never consumed. Thomas knows, with the instinctive wisdom that children carry like hidden treasure in the pockets of their souls, that this is not an ordinary morning. This is a morning when the world wears its true face, when the masks and veils that usually hide the sacred architecture of existence have been lifted by invisible hands. This is a morning when a shepherd boy might see what shepherds have always seen but learn not to speak of, when the ancient compact between human and divine reveals itself in language older than words. His small hand reaches for the wooden latch that holds the window closed, and as his fingers touch the worn wood that his grandfather's grandfather once carved with symbols that predate the cross, he feels a vibration pass through his palm and up his arm and into his heart. It is the vibration of recognition, of homecoming, of a soul touching its own true nature after lifetimes of forgetting. And in that touch, in that moment of contact between boy and wood and whatever watches from the mist-veiled hills, Thomas begins to remember what he came here to remember, begins to understand why certain boys are born to tend sheep in certain valleys in certain years, when the world prepares to reveal its deeper mysteries to those whose hearts remain pure enough to receive them. The morning light grows stronger, but it does not burn away the mystery. Instead, it illuminates it, reveals it, invites the boy to step forward into a day that will teach him things that schools and churches and the learned men of his time could never speak, could never imagine, could never contain within their careful catalogues of acceptable truth. For this is 1350, the year when the world stood balanced on the edge between one age and another, when certain souls were called to witness, to remember, and to carry forward the ancient knowledge that would otherwise be lost in the storms of change that were already gathering in the corners of tomorrow. And Thomas, shepherd boy of 7 years and 7,000 lifetimes, opens the window and steps into his destiny with the fearless grace of one who has never learned that miracles are supposed to be impossible. The morning air enters Thomas's lungs like a prayer being answered, cool and sweet and carrying within it the essence of things that grow in darkness and bloom in light. But there is something else woven into this breath, something that makes his chest expand, not just with air, but with recognition, as if his small body remembers how to breathe in a world where every inhalation connects earth to heaven through the sacred architecture of human need and divine provision. He moves across the packed earth yard toward the low stone wall that separates the cottage grounds from the vast expanse of hillside, where his father's flock spreads like stars fallen to earth and choosing to remain. Each step sends vibrations through the soles of his bare feet, vibrations that speak of deep waters flowing beneath the surface of things, of roots that extend not just down into soil but across time itself, connecting this moment to all the moments when shepherd boys have walked these same paths under the watchful eyes of powers that prefer to remain unnamed. The sheep lift their heads as he approaches, and in their eyes Thomas sees reflection of something that makes his heart beat faster, not with fear, but with the peculiar excitement that comes when the soul recognizes truth even before the mind can grasp its shape. These are not merely animals gathered for wool and meat and the simple commerce of survival. These are witnesses, guardians, living prayers that move across the landscape in patterns older than human memory, patterns that map invisible territories and mark sacred boundaries that the world of men has forgotten how to see. His father, William, stands among the flock with the weathered staff that belonged to his father and his father's father, a piece of carved oak that has absorbed 70 years of handling by hands that knew their place in the great chain of being that connects soil to soul, to the stars that wheel overhead in their eternal dance. But today, William stands differently, more erect, more alert, as if he too has awakened into awareness of currents that usually flow beneath the threshold of ordinary perception. "The morning speaks strangely today, boy," William says without turning, his voice carrying the rough music of men who have spent their lives in conversation with wind and weather, and the subtle languages that animals speak when humans remember how to listen. The sheep know it. They've been restless since before dawn, gathering in patterns I've not seen in all my years of watching. Thomas approaches his father with steps that seem to echo not just across the hillside, but across centuries, each footfall finding its place in a rhythm that shepherds have maintained since the first flock was gathered, and the first boy learned that tending sheep was also tending mysteries that the world would someday need remembered. The staff in his father's hand seems to pulse with its own life, carved with symbols that look like mere decoration to eyes that have been trained to see only surfaces, but which reveal themselves to deeper sight as maps of territories that exist between the visible and the invisible. "What patterns, father?" Thomas asks, though some part of him already knows the answer, already sees what his father sees, but from a different angle, through eyes that carry the particular clarity that belongs to souls who have not yet learned to doubt what they witness. William points with his staff toward a cluster of sheep that have arranged themselves in a rough circle around a standing stone that has marked this hillside since before the first church was built in the valley below. The stone stands no taller than a man, but its presence seems to extend both upward and downward in ways that suggest it serves as more than mere marker, as if it were a needle that stitches earth to sky, maintaining connections that would otherwise fray with the passage of seasons and the forgetting of generations. "There," William says. They circle the old stone as if protecting it. "I've seen this once before, when I was not much older than you are now. The year the great sickness came to the towns, when death walked openly through the world, and many forgot how to trust in anything beyond their own fear." Thomas watches the sheep and sees that they move not randomly but in response to currents he can almost perceive, almost understand. Their wool catches the morning light in ways that create patterns of brightness and shadow, patterns that shift and flow like writing being composed by invisible hands, messages being spelled out in a language that speaks directly to something deeper than thought, deeper than knowledge, deeper than anything the priests in their stone churches would recognize as sacred communication. The standing stone itself seems to breathe, though stone should not breathe, should not pulse with life that ebbs and flows like tides that respond to moons that orbit in dimensions parallel to, but separate from, the one that ordinary sight can encompass. Around its base the grass grows differently, greener, more vibrant, as if the stone serves as conduit for energies that nourish more than just the surface layer of existence. "What happened that year?" Thomas asks, though he suspects he already knows. Suspects that the answer will confirm something his soul remembers from dreams that come not from his own experience, but from the deeper reservoir of memory that all shepherds share, all those who have ever stood on hillsides and felt the weight of responsibility that comes with guarding what is innocent and vulnerable and essential to the continuation of mysteries that the world depends upon. William leans on his staff, his eyes fixed not on the sheep but on something beyond them, something that exists in the spaces between what is seen and what is suspected. "That year, the world grew thin," he says slowly, as if each word must be chosen carefully, as if the very act of speaking certain truths aloud might alter the fundamental structure of reality. Thin between here and elsewhere. Things that usually stay hidden came close enough to touch. Things that should have remained separate began to bleed through. The boy nods with the solemn understanding that children possess when they encounter adults, speaking truths that are usually kept wrapped in silence and stored in the deepest chambers of experience. He can feel the thinness his father describes, can sense the way this morning carries within it the possibility of revelations that will either illuminate or shatter the careful constructions of normalcy that most people use to navigate their days without being overwhelmed by the sheer vastness of what exists beyond the borders of the known. Above them, the sky seems higher than usual, as if the dome of heaven has been lifted by invisible hands to accommodate visitors that require more space than 3 dimensions can usually provide. The clouds move in formations that suggest intelligence, purpose, direction that comes from sources that exist outside the simple mechanics of weather and wind. And beneath their feet, the earth pulses with heartbeat that connects this hillside to every other place where souls have gathered to witness the intersection of time and eternity. The sheep continue their circular dance around the ancient stone, their movements creating vibrations that Thomas can feel in his bones, rhythms that sync with his own heartbeat and gradually teach his small body to pulse in harmony with forces that move through the world like invisible rivers carrying messages between the realm of form and the realm of essence. He understands now, with the immediate knowing that comes before thought and lasts after thinking ends, that he has been born into this family, into this place, into this particular moment, not by accident, but by design that serves purposes larger than any one life, but which require individual lives to serve as vessels through which larger purposes can manifest. This is why certain boys become shepherds, not simply to tend animals, but to tend the boundaries between worlds, to maintain the ancient compact between human consciousness and the forces that shape reality, from levels that remain hidden, from those who have learned to see only with their eyes and trust only what their hands can grasp. This is why shepherds appear in all the old stories, why they are chosen to receive announcements that will change the course of history, why their simple presence on hillsides serves as anchor points for revelations too vast for palaces and too pure for the complicated chambers where power accumulates and wisdom withers. Thomas takes his place beside his father, accepting without words the weight of inheritance that passes not through blood alone, but through willingness to stand witness, to remain present, to keep watch while the world sleeps and dreams and occasionally wakes into awareness of its own deeper nature. The morning continues to unfold around them, revealing layer after layer of meaning that exists simultaneously in the simple surface of pastoral routine and in the vast cosmological drama of which that routine serves as both symbol and active participation. And in the distance, moving through the mist that still clings to the valleys below, something approaches that will soon call upon everything the boy has inherited, everything he has been prepared to understand, everything his bloodline has maintained across generations of watching and waiting, and keeping faith with mysteries too important to be spoken, but too essential to be forgotten. The mist in the valley below begins to move against the wind. Thomas notices this first, his young eyes catching what his father's more experienced gaze initially misses, the way the silver-grey veils of morning vapour flow upward along the hillside, defying the natural laws that should pull them downward toward the stream that runs like liquid starlight through the heart of the lowlands. The movement is subtle, almost imperceptible, but once seen it cannot be unseen, cannot be dismissed as trick of light or confusion of perspective. Within this ascending mist, shapes begin to form, not emerging from it, but existing within it, as if the mist itself serves as doorway between this world and another, a permeable boundary that allows passage for those who understand the proper methods of crossing. Thomas feels his breathing slow, his small body entering into the profound stillness that children instinctively adopt when they witness phenomena that exist beyond the edges of ordinary explanation. "Father," he whispers, his voice barely disturbing the air between them, "do you see?" William follows his son's gaze, and Thomas watches as his father's weathered face transforms, the lines of daily concern smoothing into an expression of recognition mixed with reverence, and something that might be fear. The staff in William's hands begins to tremble, though whether from his grip or from its own response to whatever approaches through the mist, Thomas cannot tell. "I see," William breathes. "God help us both, I see." The shapes in the mist resolve into forms that challenge the eye's ability to maintain focus, beings that exist at the intersection of human and other, familiar enough to be recognized as possessing intelligence and purpose, alien enough to remind any witness that the catalogue of creatures acknowledged by common knowledge represents only the smallest fraction of what populates the vast territories that exist beyond the borders of mapped reality. They move upward through the ascending mist with a grace that suggests they are not climbing, but rather allowing themselves to be carried by currents that obey laws older than gravity, older than the physics that governs the fall of stones and the flow of water. There are 3 of them, Thomas counts, though the number seems to shift depending on how directly he looks, as if the act of observation itself influences what can be observed. Each figure stands taller than any human he has ever seen, yet their height seems to change with the angle of viewing, suggesting that their true dimensions exist partially in this realm and partially in others where measurement follows different rules. Their faces, when glimpsed, carry the terrible beauty of beings who remember what the world was like before it forgot its own divine nature, what humans were like before they learned to limit themselves to single bodies occupying single points in space and time. The sheep sense their approach before sound or sight confirms their presence. The circular dance around the standing stone transforms into something more urgent, more purposeful, as if the animals understand that they serve not merely as flock, but as living boundary markers, definitions of sacred space within which certain encounters become possible that would otherwise remain forever beyond the reach of incarnate experience. Their movements create patterns in the grass that seem to pulse with their own light, geometric forms that appear and dissolve and reappear in configurations that speak directly to some deeper layer of perception, some faculty of understanding that exists below the level of conscious thought. They come every 7 generations, William says, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge passed down through bloodlines that have maintained their connection to mysteries the world prefers to forget. My grandfather's grandfather told me, as his grandfather's grandfather told him, they come to check the seals, to ensure the boundaries hold, to confirm that the ancient agreements remain honored by those who have inherited the responsibility of keeping watch. Thomas feels something shift inside his chest, a recognition that arrives not through learning but through remembering, as if his soul is suddenly able to access memories that belong not to his 7 years of human experience, but to something older, something that existed before he took on the flesh and limitations of his current form. He understands now why he has always felt different from other children, why the games and concerns that occupy their attention have never held the same fascination for him, why he has always been drawn to the edges of things, to the spaces where the ordinary world reveals cracks through which other possibilities can be glimpsed. The visitors continue their ascent, and as they draw closer, Thomas can see that they cast shadows that fall upward instead of down, shadows that seem to extend not across the ground but into the sky itself, reaching towards stars that remain invisible in the bright morning light, but which exist nonetheless, which maintain their vigil even when hidden by the solar radiance that blinds human eyes to the vast networks of intelligence that populate the spaces between worlds. What do they want? Thomas asks, though he suspects the question itself reveals his incomplete understanding of what is occurring. These beings do not want in the way humans want, do not desire or seek or pursue goals that can be satisfied through acquisition or achievement. They simply are, and their presence here represents not ambition but duty, not choice but function, not individual will but participation in cosmic maintenance that requires consciousness capable of operating across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. William shifts his grip on his staff, and Thomas notices that the carved symbols along its length have begun to glow with soft light that seems to emanate from within the wood itself. They want to see, his father says, to witness, to confirm that the bloodline continues, that the knowledge remains intact, that someone still remembers how to stand at the crossing points when the worlds grow thin enough to permit passage. The first of the visitors reaches the stone circle, and the sheep part before it like water flowing around an obstacle that exists in dimensions they cannot fully perceive, but which they recognize as deserving of reverence. The being for Thomas can find no better word for what he witnesses, moves with fluid grace that suggests its body, while appearing solid, operates according to principles that transcend the usual limitations of matter. Its presence creates ripples in the air itself, distortions that reveal the normally invisible fabric of space as something that can be affected by consciousness, advanced enough to recognize and interact with the fundamental forces that shape reality from its deepest levels. When it turns its attention toward Thomas, the boy feels his awareness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual self, feels his consciousness touch something vast and ancient and infinitely patient. For a moment that exists outside the normal flow of time, he sees through its eyes, sees the hillside as it truly is, not merely landscape but living mandala, not simply grass and stone, but active geometric expression of divine mathematics, not just home to sheep and shepherds, but anchor point in a web of sacred sites that extends across the entire planet, maintaining the stability that allows incarnate life to continue its slow evolution toward remembrance of its own divine nature. In that expanded moment of vision, Thomas understands why shepherd boys are chosen for this work, why consciousness that remains pure and flexible and unhardened by too much contact with the world's cynicism can serve as bridge between the human and the more than human. He sees the long chain of his inheritance, stretching backward through generations of watchers and forward into futures that depend upon the maintenance of connections that exist below the threshold of ordinary awareness, but which sustain the very possibility of existence itself. The being before him nods, a gesture so subtly human that it carries profound intimacy, recognition of kinship that transcends the obvious differences between their forms of embodiment. And in that nod, Thomas receives confirmation that he has been accepted, acknowledged, welcomed into the ancient order of those who maintain the boundaries and tend the crossings and keep faith with mysteries that the world needs more than it knows but understands less than it fears. The morning light continues to strengthen around them, but instead of dispersing the sense of otherworldly presence, it seems to amplify it, to reveal rather than conceal the sacred dimensions that interpenetrate the ordinary landscape of hill and valley and stream. Thomas realizes that this is what it means to wake up as a shepherd boy in 1350. Not simply to open one's eyes in a particular time and place, but to awaken into awareness of the eternal responsibilities that certain souls accept before they are born, the cosmic maintenance work that requires human participation, but which most humans have forgotten how to recognize, much less perform. And as the visitors complete their circuit of the stone, as they acknowledge the seals and confirm the boundaries and bless the continuation of the ancient compact, Thomas feels his own awakening deepen, feels himself becoming not just witness to mystery, but active participant in the great work that keeps the worlds in proper relationship to each other, that maintains the delicate balance between revelation and concealment, that allows evolution to proceed at the pace that souls can bear, without being shattered by too much truth arriving too quickly. The mist begins to descend again, carrying the visitors back toward whatever realm normally contains them, but their departure leaves something behind. Not just memory, but activation, not just encounter, but initiation into understanding that will shape everything that follows in Thomas's life. Everything he will become, everything he will remember when other forms of memory have faded into the silence that awaits all embodied existence. As the mist-carried visitors fade back into the spaces between visible and invisible, Thomas finds himself drawn toward the standing stone with a magnetism that seems to arise not from curiosity, but from recognition, as if some part of him has been waiting his entire young life for permission to approach this ancient marker that has stood sentinel on the hillside since before the first church bell rang in the valley below, since before the Roman roads carved their straight lines through landscapes that prefer curves, since before memory itself learned to distinguish between what happened and what always is. The sheep maintain their circular formation around the stone, but now their movement has settled into a slower rhythm, more like breathing than dancing, as if the completion of the visitor's inspection has returned them to their role as guardians rather than witnesses. Their wall seems to hold traces of the otherworldly light that accompanied the beings from the mist, creating subtle patterns of luminescence that pulse in harmony with Thomas's heartbeat, and gradually teach his young body to attune itself to frequencies that exist beneath the ordinary spectrum of human perception. William follows his son toward the stone circle, his weathered face reflecting the complex mixture of pride and trepidation that comes when a father realizes his child is being called to participate in mysteries that extend far beyond the scope of ordinary parental guidance. The staff in his hands continues to emit its soft glow, the carved symbols pulsing with rhythms that seem to respond to the proximity of the ancient stone, as if the wood remembers its own origins in trees that grew in soil nourished by energies that connect the deepest roots to the highest stars. "Careful, boy," William says, though his tone carries instruction rather than warning. The stone drinks starlight and dreams in languages older than human words. Those who approach it carelessly find their minds open to visions they're not prepared to contain, but those who come with proper reverence. He pauses, his eyes finding Thomas's face and reading there the signs of readiness that he recognizes from his own childhood encounter with mysteries that shaped everything that followed. Those who come with proper reverence sometimes receive gifts that last lifetimes. Thomas steps into the circle formed by the sheep, and immediately he feels the change in the air itself, as if he has entered a space where different laws apply, where the normal boundaries between thought and thing, between self and world, become permeable in ways that allow consciousness to extend beyond the usual limitations of individual embodiment. The ground beneath his bare feet vibrates with subtle energy that rises from depths that cannot be measured in simple distance, depths that extend not just downward into the earth, but downward through layers of reality that exist below the surface of what most people consider real. The stone itself stands before him like a doorway made of solidified time, its surface worn smooth by centuries of weather, yet somehow maintaining the crisp definition of symbols carved by hands that understood geometry as sacred language, mathematics as prayer, proportion as method of encoding cosmic principles into forms that could survive the rise and fall of civilizations, while continuing to broadcast their essential messages to those who retained the ability to read stone as scripture, mineral as manuscript, crystal as crystallized wisdom from ages when the world spoke more openly to its children. As Thomas approaches, the symbols on the stone begin to respond to his presence, not by glowing with obvious light, but by becoming more themselves, more clearly defined, more present, as if his awareness serves as catalyst that activates properties that remain dormant until witnessed by consciousness capable of recognition. The patterns carved into the stone reveal themselves as maps, not of territories that can be walked by feet, but of territories that can only be navigated by souls, star charts for inner voyages, geometric instructions for consciousness seeking to remember its own multidimensional nature. He reaches out one small hand and touches the stone's surface, and the contact sends vibrations through his entire being that seem to awaken every cell to its participation in cosmic processes that extend far beyond the boundaries of individual existence. For a moment that contains eternities, Thomas experiences himself not as separate observer, but as integral element in a vast living system that includes the stone, the sheep, the hillside, the mist-veiled valleys, the stars that wheel overhead even in daylight, and consciousness itself as the medium through which the universe comes to know its own infinite creativity. Through the stone, he feels the presence of all the others who have touched this surface across the centuries. Shepherds and seers, watchers and wayfarers, children and ancient ones who came seeking connection to something larger than their individual concerns, something that could provide context for the brief span of incarnate existence within the vast expanse of eternal becoming. Their experiences flow through him like water through a clear vessel, not overwhelming his young awareness but expanding it, teaching it to contain more than he previously imagined possible. William watches his son's initiation with the complex emotions of one who has himself undergone similar expansion and knows both its gifts and its responsibilities. He sees the moment when Thomas's consciousness touches the deeper currents, sees the boy's eyes widen with recognition of vastness that exists not as empty space but as fullness, too complete to be grasped by ordinary thought, too present to be captured by usual methods of understanding. "What do you see?" William asks, though he knows that what his son experiences will likely exceed the capacity of language to convey, will require new words or very old ones, words that carry the weight of mystery rather than the precision of definition. Thomas remains connected to the stone for long moments before responding, his awareness slowly returning from territories that exist parallel to this hillside, but which encompass dimensions that the physical landscape can only hint at through its sacred geometry, its alignment with cosmic forces, its function as terrestrial anchor for celestial influences that require material expression in order to affect the course of events in the world where choices are made and consequences unfold across generations. "I see." Thomas begins, then pauses, his young mind searching for ways to translate vision into words that can bridge the gap between experience and communication. "I see that this place is like a star that fell to earth and learned to grow roots instead of burning. I see that the stone remembers when the sky was closer, when angels walked openly among the flocks, when shepherd boys were chosen not just to tend sheep, but to tend the doorways between worlds." He turns to face his father, and William sees in his son's eyes the particular brightness that comes when consciousness has been expanded beyond its previous limitations, and must now learn to operate in this larger context while maintaining connection to the practical requirements of daily existence. It is the brightness of souls who have touched their own eternal nature and must now find ways to honor that truth while continuing to inhabit forms that seem temporary, fragile, bound by laws that the eternal self knows are only provisionally real. I see that we are not alone, Thomas continues, his voice carrying new depths that suggest his words arise not just from personal observation, but from connection to sources of knowing that transcend individual experience. There are others like us, scattered across the world, tending their own stones, maintaining their own boundaries, keeping their own watch. We are all connected, all part of something larger, something that needs us, but which we need even more. The sheep around them begin to move in new patterns, their circular formation expanding and contracting like a living mandala that breathes with the rhythm of forces that move through the landscape in cycles too vast for human timekeeping to measure, but which can be felt by consciousness, attuned to the deeper pulse that connects all manifestation to its source in the unmanifest, all form to its origin in the formless, all individual awareness to its ground in the universal consciousness that dreams all dreams and awakens all dreamers. William nods with the satisfaction of one who has witnessed the successful completion of an initiation that he himself received decades ago, an awakening that prepared him for his role as guardian and guide, and eventually as father, to one who would carry the tradition forward into times that would require even greater dedication to the maintenance of connections between worlds. He sees in Thomas not just his son, but the next link in a chain of consciousness that extends both backward and forward through time, connecting the ancient wisdom keepers to those who will inherit their responsibilities in ages yet to come. Now you understand, William says, his voice carrying the weight of acknowledgement and the lightness of relief that comes when sacred knowledge finds its way successfully from one generation to the next. Now you understand why certain boys are born to shepherd flocks in places where stones drink starlight, and visitors come from the mist to check the seals that keep the worlds in proper relationship to each other. Thomas removes his hand from the stone, but the connection remains, will always remain. For consciousness once expanded cannot return to its previous limitations, but must learn to operate in this enlarged context, must find ways to honor both the practical requirements of incarnate existence and the cosmic responsibilities that come with awareness of one's participation in the great work that maintains the possibility of evolution, of growth, of the gradual awakening of matter to its own spiritual nature. The morning continues around them, but it is no longer an ordinary morning, no longer simply the transition between night and day, but a threshold between one level of understanding and another, one phase of existence and the next, one way of being human and another way that includes more than human, while never abandoning its humanity, never forgetting that consciousness requires form in order to participate in the world where love learns to express itself through service, where wisdom manifests through tending what is vulnerable, where the eternal realizes itself through the careful stewardship of the temporal. And as father and son stand together in the circle of sheep that guard the stone that drinks starlight, both understanding that everything has changed while everything remains the same, the hillside settles into the deeper rhythm that pulses beneath all surface appearances, the rhythm that connects this moment to all moments, this place to all places, this awakening to the great awakening that proceeds through countless individual recognitions of the sacred nature that exists at the heart of even the most ordinary circumstances, even the simplest lives, even the humblest service to the continuation of mystery in a world that desperately needs mystery. The sheep know things that humans have forgotten how to remember. Thomas understands this now, standing in the circle of wool and warmth and watching as the animals move in patterns that map invisible territories, create living geometry that serves as both protection and invitation, both boundary and bridge between the world of surface appearances and the deeper realm where consciousness meets its own source and discovers that separation is the grandest illusion ever conceived by minds seeking to understand unity through the experience of division. Each sheep carries within its simple form a complexity that extends far beyond the obvious facts of flesh and fleece, blood and breath, and the basic needs that drive most animal existence. These particular sheep, tended by generations of shepherds who maintained their connection to the ancient knowledge, have become something more than livestock. They have become vessels for memory that spans centuries, carriers of wisdom that flows through bloodlines both human and animal, both visible and invisible. Thomas moves among them now with new awareness, his recently expanded consciousness allowing him to perceive the subtle emanations that surround each animal like halos made of crystallized intention, like auric fields that carry information about their role in the cosmic maintenance work that keeps the boundaries stable between realms that must remain separate enough to maintain their distinct natures, yet connected enough to allow the flow of consciousness that enables evolution to proceed across multiple levels of existence simultaneously. The ram that leads the flock carries himself with dignity that suggests ancient lineage, bloodlines that trace back to creatures that grazed in Eden before the gates were closed, before the paths between paradise and ordinary earth were hidden beneath layers of forgetting so thick that only the most dedicated seekers could find their way through the accumulated debris of centuries spent believing that matter and spirit exist in opposition rather than in marriage. But heaven and earth inhabit different dimensions rather than the same space seen from different angles of vision. His name is Gabriel, William says, approaching the ram with the reverence due to beings who serve as ambassadors between species, between levels of consciousness, between time and eternity. Not named for the angel, but sharing something with the angel, some quality of presence that allows messages to pass through him from sources that prefer to remain unnamed, but which require manifestation in forms that incarnate awareness can recognize and receive without being overwhelmed by direct contact with intelligence too vast for individual minds to contain. Thomas watches as his father extends his hand toward the ram, sees how Gabriel's dark eyes reflect depths that seem to extend beyond the boundaries of animal consciousness into territories usually reserved for beings who have achieved levels of awareness that transcend the usual limitations of embodied existence. The ram allows the touch but maintains the dignity of one who grants favor rather than one who submits to authority, acknowledging the ancient compact that binds shepherd and flock in relationships that serve purposes larger than either species could accomplish independently. Around Gabriel, the ewes arrange themselves in configurations that create what Thomas can now recognize as sacred geometry made manifest in flesh and wool, living mandalas that pulse with their own intelligence, their own purpose, their own connection to the cosmic forces that move through all manifestation, but which can only be perceived by consciousness that has learned to read the signatures that every form of life carries as evidence of its participation in the great pattern that connects all things while allowing each thing to maintain its unique expression of the universal creative principle. They remember the songs, William continues, his voice carrying the particular tone that adults use when speaking truths that children will understand more fully as they mature, but which must be planted now, must be seeded in young awareness, so that future understanding can grow from roots established in innocence, in the time before cynicism and doubt create barriers that make reception of certain kinds of knowledge increasingly difficult. The songs that were sung when the world was younger, when the barriers between species were more permeable, when communication flowed more freely between all forms of consciousness. Thomas listens, and gradually he begins to hear what his father means. Not audible melodies, but something deeper, more fundamental. Vibrations that exist below the threshold of ordinary hearing, but which affect the entire nervous system, create resonances in bones and blood, and the subtle energy systems that connect individual organisms to the larger web of intelligence that spans the planet and extends beyond the planet to include the whole solar system, the galaxy, the universe itself as a single living entity, dreaming infinite dreams through infinite forms of awareness. The songs carry information, not facts or data in the modern sense, but living knowledge that transforms consciousness in the very process of reception. Wisdom that cannot be separated from the being who receives it, understanding that becomes integral to the receiver's own nature, rather than something possessed or owned or accumulated like objects in a collection. This is why the sheep serve as carriers for such knowledge. Their awareness remains fluid enough to allow the songs to flow through them, without creating the crystallizations of ego that often block the transmission of wisdom from its source to those whom it might benefit. One of the younger ewes approaches Thomas directly, her movements carrying intention that suggests individual recognition, personal connection that transcends the general relationship between human and animal to become something more specific, more intimate, more aligned with the particular role that this boy has been prepared to fulfill in the ongoing work of maintaining connections between worlds. Her wool carries patterns of light and shade that seem to shift and flow, like writing being composed by invisible hands, messages being spelled out in a language that speaks directly to faculties of perception that exist below the level of conscious thought. When Thomas reaches out to touch her fleece, he feels the same expansion of awareness that he experienced with the stone. But now the expansion carries different qualities, warmer, more nurturing, more specifically attuned to the kinds of understanding that flow through bloodlines and breeding lines, through genetic memory and cellular wisdom, through the slow accumulation of experiences that shapes not just individual consciousness, but species consciousness, not just personal memory, but collective memory that spans generations and carries forward the essential lessons that each form of life learns through its participation. Through connection with the you, Thomas experiences flashes of vision that show him the long history of his bloodline's relationship with these particular animals, sees the unbroken chain of shepherds and flocks that extends backward through centuries of faithful service to principles that most of the world has forgotten, but which these simple arrangements of human and animal consciousness have preserved through their willingness to maintain traditional roles, traditional connections, traditional ways of being that honor the sacred dimensions of existence while attending to the practical requirements of survival. He sees his great-grandfather as a young man, standing in this same circle with sheep that were ancestors to these sheep, receiving his own initiation into mysteries that would shape his entire life and prepare him for the responsibilities that would eventually pass to his son, and his son's son, and finally to Thomas himself, carrying forward through bloodline and commitment the ancient knowledge that the world needs but rarely acknowledges, rarely honors, rarely supports, in the ways that such knowledge deserves to be supported. The vision expands to show him shepherds in other places, other times, all connected by invisible threads of purpose and dedication, all serving as anchor points for forces that require manifestation in the physical realm, but which can only maintain their presence through the cooperation of consciousness that remains pure enough to serve as clear channels, unclouded by the ambitions and anxieties that often distort the transmission of sacred influence from its source to its intended recipients. These shepherds, scattered across the globe and across time, form a network of awareness that spans continents and cultures, that transcends the superficial differences between religions and languages and customs, to maintain connection to the deeper currents that flow beneath all surface manifestations of human spiritual seeking. They are the keepers of the old ways, the maintainers of the ancient compact, the guardians of mysteries that predate written history, but which must be preserved through living transmission, through direct experience, through the kind of knowledge that can only be passed from consciousness to consciousness, through relationships that honor both the human need for understanding and the cosmic need for embodied awareness that can serve as bridge between the manifest. Thomas withdraws his hand from the ew's fleece, but like his contact with the stone, the connection remains, will always remain, for consciousness once touched by such recognition cannot return to its previous limitations, but must learn to operate in this expanded context, must find ways to integrate the vastness of what has been received with the specific requirements of the life that must continue to be lived in service to the greater purposes that such expansion makes visible and accessible. The morning light continues to strengthen around them, revealing more clearly the landscape that serves as stage for these ancient dramas of awakening, these recurring cycles of initiation that ensure the continuation of knowledge that the world depends upon, but which exists at the margins of what most people consider important, necessary, worthy of attention and respect. But Thomas now understands that margins are often where the most essential work takes place, where the boundaries are maintained that allow the center to continue functioning, where the connections are preserved that make possible the transmission of wisdom from age to age, from generation to generation, from those who have awakened to those who are ready to awaken. The sheep around him continue their slow circulation, their movements creating patterns that serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Practical protection for the flock, sacred geometry that maintains the integrity of the space, living mandala that connects earth to heaven through the simple fact of animals moving in harmony with forces that exist beyond their individual understanding, but which they serve through their willingness to participate in arrangements that benefit the whole, rather than merely the parts. And Thomas, shepherd boy of 7 years and countless lifetimes, takes his place within this ancient pattern, accepting his role not as burden but as gift, not as limitation but as liberation into understanding that connects his individual existence to purposes vast enough to give meaning to every moment, every breath, every choice that will follow from this awakening, into awareness of what it truly means to wake up as a shepherd boy in 1350. In any time, in the eternal now, where all awakenings occur and all shepherds discover their true calling. Below the hillside, where morning mist still clings to the stream that carries melted snow from mountains whose peaks touch clouds that remember when the world was young, the valley spreads like an open palm extended toward heaven, its contours shaped by forces both geological and spiritual, both natural and supernatural, both temporal and eternal. Thomas sees it now with eyes that have been opened to the sacred geometry that underlies all landscapes, the divine mathematics that determines where waters flow and where stones come to rest, and where certain souls are called to stand witness to mysteries that require specific combinations of earth and sky, matter and consciousness, human awareness and more than human presence. From his position within the stone circle, surrounded by sheep whose wool carries starlight and whose movements map invisible territories, Thomas can perceive the valley not merely as geographical feature, but as vast mandala, living symbol that encodes cosmic principles in forms that incarnate consciousness can read if it retains the ability to see beyond surfaces to the essential patterns that connect all manifestation to its source in the unmanifest, all form to its origin in the formless, all individual expression to its ground in universal creativity. The stream that winds through the valley floor follows curves that mirror the sacred spirals found in shells and galaxies, in the arrangement of seeds in sunflowers and the motion of planets around stars, suggesting that consciousness at work in the formation of landscapes operates according to the same principles that govern the organization of matter at every scale, from the smallest particles to the largest cosmic structures. This stream carries more than water. It carries memory, information, the crystallized wisdom of all the terrain it has traversed, all the stones it has smoothed, all the roots it has nourished in its long journey from source to sea. William joins his son at the edge of the stone circle, his weathered face reflecting the complex mixture of satisfaction and solemnity that comes when one generation successfully passes essential knowledge to the next, when ancient wisdom finds its way intact through the perilous passage from elder to younger, from those who have carried certain responsibilities to those who must now accept the weight of those same responsibilities for their own lifetime of service. The staff in his hand seems lighter now, as if the successful completion of Thomas's initiation has released some burden that had been accumulating across the years of waiting, watching, preparing for this moment of transmission. "The valley has been waiting for you," William says, his voice carrying the particular quality that adults use when speaking truths that will not be fully understood until experience provides the context necessary for complete comprehension. Not waiting as humans wait, with impatience or anxiety, but waiting as the earth waits for spring, as seeds wait for rain, as consciousness waits for the proper conditions that allow potential to actualize, possibility to become reality, promise to fulfill itself through the cooperation of will and circumstance. Thomas looks down into the valley and sees what his father means. The landscape itself seems to pulse with anticipation, with readiness, with the particular quality of aliveness that indicates preparation for events that exist beyond the normal cycle of seasons and weather, beyond the usual patterns of growth and harvest, beyond the ordinary rhythms that mark the passage of time in regions where mystery remains hidden beneath the surface of everyday concerns and practical necessities. Near the center of the valley, where the stream makes its widest curve and the meadows reach their fullest flower, stands a grove of ancient trees whose presence seems to anchor something in the landscape, to serve as living pillars that support connections between earth and heaven, between the visible realm and the invisible dimensions that interpenetrate it without being contained by it. These trees, predate the human settlement of this region, predate the churches and roads and boundaries that have organized the valley according to human needs and human understanding, predate even the standing stone that marks the hilltop where Thomas now stands, receiving his education in mysteries that the world of men acknowledges only in its oldest stories, its deepest dreams, its most carefully guarded traditions. The trees themselves seem to breathe with consciousness that spans centuries, that encompasses within its vast awareness the entire history of this valley, all the creatures that have sheltered beneath its branches, all the souls that have sought wisdom or refuge, or simply the peace that comes from proximity to beings whose existence demonstrates the possibility of longevity, stability, connection to something larger than individual survival. Their leaves catch and hold light in ways that create patterns of brightness and shadow, that shift and flow like writing being composed by invisible hands, messages being spelled out in the language of living systems, communications that speak directly to faculties of perception that exist below the threshold of ordinary thought. The grove marks the place where angels have always walked openly, William explains, his words carrying the weight of knowledge that has been preserved, not through books or documents, but through direct transmission from consciousness to consciousness, from those who have witnessed to those who are prepared to witness, from those who remember. It is one of the thin places, one of the crossing points where the boundaries between worlds become permeable enough to allow passage for beings whose normal habitat exists in dimensions that require different laws, different possibilities, different relationships between matter and spirit. Thomas feels the truth of this statement resonate in his bones, in his blood, in the subtle energy systems that connect his individual awareness to the larger web of consciousness that spans the planet and extends beyond the planet to include the whole universe as a single living entity, dreaming infinite dreams through infinite forms of embodiment. The grove draws his attention with magnetic force that seems to arise not from curiosity but from recognition, as if some part of him has been there before, has walked among those trees in states of consciousness that transcend the usual limitations of incarnate existence. Around them, the sheep continue their circular movement, but now their pattern seems to be creating a vortex of energy that spirals downward from the hilltop toward the valley floor, connecting the stone circle to the grove through invisible channels that carry influences from the realm of angels to the realm of humans, from the dimensions where consciousness operates without the constraints of physical form, to the dimension where consciousness must learn to work through bodies, through brains, through nervous systems that filter infinite awareness into the particular perspectives that allow individual souls to participate in the great experiment of incarnate evolution. The morning light continues to strengthen, but instead of dispersing the sense of otherworldly presence, it seems to concentrate it, to focus it, to prepare the valley for visitations that occur not randomly, but according to cycles that respond to cosmic influences, celestial alignments, the particular confluence of conditions that make possible direct contact between levels of reality that usually remain separate in order to preserve the integrity of their distinct functions, their unique contributions to the whole. Thomas can feel the approach of something vast, something magnificent, something that will require every faculty of perception that his recent initiation has awakened if he is to receive what is offered without being overwhelmed by its magnitude. The valley holds its breath, the stream slows its flow, the trees in the grove lean inward as if to create a more intimate space for communion that transcends the usual barriers between species, between levels of consciousness, between the mortal and the immortal. They come at the time of great transitions, William says, his voice barely disturbing the pregnant silence that has settled over the landscape like a benediction. When one age prepares to end and another prepares to begin, when the old ways must be preserved but also transformed, when certain souls must be prepared to carry forward the ancient knowledge into times that will require new forms of expression, new methods of transmission, new ways of maintaining the connections that keep the worlds in proper relationship to each other. The year 1350 hangs between breaths, between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, suspended in the particular kind of time that exists at crossing points, at thresholds, at the edges of possibilities that will reshape not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human development on this planet. Thomas feels himself becoming part of something larger than his own existence, larger than his family's tradition, larger than the valley that contains his small life, like a jewel held in the palm of consciousness, too vast to be measured by ordinary standards of size and duration. And in the grove below, where ancient trees prepare to witness once again the descent of beings whose presence reminds incarnate awareness of its own celestial origins, its own participation in cosmic processes that extend far beyond the boundaries of single planets, single solar systems, single galaxies spinning in the infinite darkness that is not empty but full, not void but pregnant with possibilities that await the proper conditions for manifestation, for birth, for the emergence of new forms of beauty, new expressions of love, new ways of being conscious in a universe that exists for no other purpose than to know itself through the eyes of all who have learned to see. In the grove where ancient trees hold court with eternity, where angels have always walked in forms too beautiful for human eyes to bear directly, something begins to descend that makes the very air sparkle with frequencies of light that exist beyond the spectrum visible to ordinary sight. Thomas feels his awareness expanding once again, but now the expansion carries qualities of homecoming rather than exploration, recognition rather than discovery, remembering rather than learning something entirely new. The descent occurs not through physical space, but through layers of consciousness, dimensions of awareness that interpenetrate the landscape without being contained by it. Realms of being that exist simultaneously here and elsewhere, now and always, in time and beyond the reach of time altogether. What comes is not separate from what has always been present, but rather an unveiling of presence that pervades every moment, every breath, every heartbeat, but which usually remains hidden beneath the surface appearance of ordinary existence. Thomas understands now, with the immediate knowing that arrives before thought and lasts after thinking ends, that awakening as a shepherd boy in 1350 was never about becoming something new, but about remembering something eternal, something that exists prior to birth and continues after death, something that uses incarnate existence as vehicle for experiencing itself in forms that can touch and be touched, can love and be loved, can serve and be served in the great circulation of consciousness that moves through all manifestation, like breath moving through a body, like blood moving through a heart. The beings that manifest in the grove carry within their luminous forms the accumulated wisdom of all ages, all places, all the moments when consciousness has awakened to its own divine nature and discovered that separation is illusion, that distance is perspective, that time is simply the medium through which eternal love learns to express itself in ways that finite awareness can receive without being dissolved by the intensity of infinite compassion. They come not as visitors from elsewhere but as reminders of what has always been here, what will always be here, what exists at the center of every experience regardless of how far consciousness may seem to wander in its exploration of possibilities that exist within the vast field of divine play. William stands beside his son in the stone circle, and Thomas can see in his father's weathered face the reflection of light that comes not from the sun, but from the recognition dawning in his own young heart. The recognition that this moment, this awakening, this remembering, has been occurring since before the first star learned to shine, has been continuing through every apparent beginning and ending, has been the true content of every story ever told by souls seeking to share their glimpses of the beauty that exists at the heart of all existence. The sheep around them have settled into perfect stillness, their wool catching and holding light that transforms their simple forms into living sculptures of devotion, prayer made manifest in flesh and fleece, worship that requires no words because it arises spontaneously from consciousness that has touched its own source, and discovered that gratitude is the natural response of awareness when it recognizes its participation in the miracle of being, the mystery of existence. Through the connection that binds Thomas to the stone, to the sheep, to the valley and the grove and the beings of light that move among the ancient trees like memories becoming visible, like prayers receiving answers, like love recognizing itself in all the forms it has assumed in its endless exploration of what it means to be, to know, to create beauty from the raw material of consciousness itself. The boy experiences the vast network of awakened souls that spans not just this planet but countless worlds, countless dimensions, countless expressions of the one life that lives all lives, dreams all dreams, awakens Audrey. He sees that every shepherd boy who has ever tended flocks in sacred valleys has been himself in different times, different forms, different expressions of the same essential nature that exists before names and after stories, that uses personalities like costumes and lifetimes, like chapters in a book too vast to be read by individual minds, but which can be lived, can be experienced, can be participated in, through the willingness to serve something larger than personal concerns, personal ambitions, personal understanding of what existence is supposed to provide, for those who inhabit bodies and learn to love, through the constraints and possibilities that embodiment makes available. The recognition brings not weight, but lightness, not burden, but liberation, not confusion, but clarity that cuts through all the complexities that minds create, when they forget their connection to the simplicity that exists at the heart of all complexity, the silence that exists at the center of all sound, the stillness that exists at the source of all movement. Thomas laughs, actually laughs with the joy that comes when consciousness discovers that it has been seeking what it has never lost, pursuing what it has always been, trying to become what it already is and always was and always will be, regardless of the forms it assumes or abandons in its play of recognition and concealment, revelation and mystery. The laughter ripples through the stone circle, through the flock of sheep whose presence anchors heaven to earth and earth to heaven, through the valley where morning mist carries messages between visible and invisible, through the grove where beings of light remind incarnate awareness of its own luminous nature, and finally into the vast web of consciousness that connects this moment to all moments, this place to all places, this awakening to the great awakening that proceeds through countless individual recognitions of the sacred nature that exists at the heart of all experience, all existence, all the love that manifests as shepherd boys and sheep, and stones that drink starlight and aim. William places his weathered hand on his son's shoulder, and Thomas feels the transmission complete, not just of knowledge or tradition or responsibility, but of being itself, of the essence that moves through bloodlines and chooses forms and accepts incarnations in service to the continuation of love's recognition of itself in all the countless ways that consciousness can awaken to its own infinite nature. The staff passes between them, not as object, but as symbol, not as possession, but as sacred trust, not as ending, but as beginning of the next cycle in the eternal spiral of remembering and forgetting. And remembering again that allows love to experience the joy of recognition, the delight of homecoming, the ecstasy of return to what was never really left. The morning reaches its fullness around them, revealing the landscape in all its beauty, hills and valleys, streams and stones, sheep and shepherds, trees and sky, all of it pulsing with the same light that illuminates the grove where angels walk in forms too beautiful to be seen directly, but which can be felt, can be known, can be participated in by consciousness that has remembered its own celestial nature, its own participation in the cosmic dance of creation and recognition, manifestation and return. And Thomas, shepherd boy of 7 years and 7,000 lifetimes, takes his place in the ancient order of those who tend the boundaries and maintain the connections and keep faith with mysteries that the world needs more than it knows but understands less than it fears. But now he carries within his small form the recognition that there are no boundaries, no separations, no distances that can divide what love has united, what consciousness has recognized as its own true nature, what existence has revealed as its own deepest secret, that all of this, all of it, every moment and every breath and every heartbeat, is the one life living itself, knowing itself, loving itself through forms too numerous to count, and too beautiful to fully comprehend, but which can be served, can be tended, can be honored through the simple willingness to remain present to the miracle that never ceased, the awakening that never ended. 3 moons have passed since Thomas first touched the stone that drinks starlight. 3 cycles of waxing and waning that have taught his young consciousness to flow with rhythms older than human timekeeping, older than the careful measurements by which monasteries mark their hours of prayer, and merchants calculate their profits, and farmers track the passage of seasons through the familiar sequence of planting and harvest. But these 3 months have contained lifetimes of learning, eons of remembering, cosmic cycles of awakening that have transformed the boy not through the accumulation of new information, but through the gradual unveiling of knowledge that his soul carried into this incarnation, like seeds waiting for the proper condition and acceptance. The morning finds him standing once again in the stone circle, but now his presence here carries different weight, different purpose, different connection to the vast network of consciousness that spans continents and centuries through the dedicated service of souls who have accepted the responsibility of maintaining bridges between worlds. The sheep move around him in patterns that have become as familiar as his own heartbeat, as natural as breathing, yet which continue to reveal new layers of meaning, new dimensions of sacred geometry, new ways that simple movements of wool and flesh can encode cosmic principles and broadcast them across landscapes that extend far beyond the boundaries of this particular hillside. William approaches through the morning mist carrying not his usual staff but a new one, carved from wood that Thomas has never seen before. Darker, denser, marked with symbols that seem to shift and flow like living script, like writing that continues to compose itself according to laws that exist beyond the reach of human languages, beyond the limitations of alphabets and grammars, and all the careful structures that minds create when they attempt to capture infinite truth in finite forms. The staff pulses with its own life, its own awareness, its own connection to sources of power that require no external validation because they draw their authority from the fundamental forces that shape reality at levels too deep for ordinary perception to access. "Today you meet your brothers," William says, his voice carrying undertones that suggest this moment has been anticipated, prepared for, arranged according to timing that responds to influences more subtle than the simple passage of days and nights. Today you discover that what you carry is not yours alone, that what you have awakened to exists not in isolation but as part of a living web that connects all who have been chosen to serve as guardians, as witnesses, as keepers of the ancient knowledge that the world needs but rarely acknowledges. As if summoned by his father's words, figures begin to emerge from the mist that still clings to the valleys below, shapes that resolve gradually into the forms of other shepherds, other boys, others who carry themselves with the particular quality of presence that Thomas has learned to recognize in himself, the stillness of those who have touched something vast, the alertness of those who have accepted responsibility for maintaining connections that exist beyond the reach of ordinary awareness, the dignity of those who serve purposes larger than personal ambition or individual understanding. They come from different directions, following paths that Thomas cannot see, but which he can feel. Invisible roads that connect sacred site to sacred site, across distances that cannot be measured in miles or leagues, but only in the currency of consciousness, in the particular forms of attunement that allow awareness to navigate territories that exist parallel to the physical landscape, but which encompass dimensions that physical geography can only hint at, through its arrangement of hills and valleys, streams and stones, places where the boundary between visible and invisible grows thin enough to permit passage for those who know the proper methods of crossing. The first to reach the stone circle is a boy who appears to be Thomas's own age, though his dark eyes carry depths that suggest lifetimes of experience, generations of inherited wisdom, bloodlines that trace back to civilizations that existed before the current arrangement of continents and oceans. His staff matches Thomas's father's new implement, dark wood marked with flowing symbols, carved with patterns that speak directly to faculties of recognition that exist below the threshold of conscious thought. Around his shoulders, a cloak of undyed wool bears embroidered designs that map territories Thomas has seen only in visions, landscapes that exist in the spaces between dreaming and waking, between memory and anticipation. "I am Marcus," the boy says, his voice carrying accents that suggest origins in regions where Latin mingles with older tongues, where Roman roads cross paths that predate the empire, where Christian prayers echo in valleys that remember gods whose names have been forgotten by all, except the stones and trees and streams that witness their worship. I tend the flocks that graze the hills above Rome, where the 7 sacred mounts hold anchors for influences that flow from constellation to constellation, from star system to star system, through networks of connection that span the galaxy and extend beyond the galaxy to include the whole universe as a single living mandala of consciousness, knowing itself through infinite forms of embodiment. The second boy emerges from mist that carries the scent of different flowers, different spices, different combinations of earth and air, that speak of landscapes where olive trees grow silver green, under skies that hold the particular quality of light that has inspired painters and poets and mystics for millennia beyond counting. His skin bears the golden tone of those who live where sun and stone create partnerships older than human memory, where consciousness learns to flow like honey, like wine, like the amber light that transforms everything it touches into expressions of beauty too profound for words to capture yet too essential to remain unspoken. "I am Dmitri," he says, his accent carrying the music of Greek that flows like water over stones worn smooth by centuries of contemplation, by generations of philosophers who learned to think with their hearts and feel with their minds, until the artificial boundaries between different faculties of perception dissolved into the unified awareness that recognizes all thinking, all feeling, all knowing, as expressions of the same essential consciousness exploring its own infinite nature through the delicate instruments of embodied souls. I serve the mysteries that flow through islands where gods once walked openly among mortals, where the veils between worlds remain thin enough that angels still visit those who maintain the old ways, the old connections, the old understanding of what it means to be human in a universe that dreams itself into existence through the loving attention of all who learn to see. Others continue to arrive as the morning strengthens, each carrying the distinctive presence of one who has been awakened to his role in the great work that spans continents and cultures, that transcends the superficial differences between languages and customs and beliefs to serve the deeper currents that flow beneath all surface manifestations of human spiritual seeking. They come from the hills above Santiago, where pilgrims walk paths that connect earth to heaven through the simple act of placing one foot before another, in rhythms that sync consciousness with the larger pulse that moves through all creation. They come from the Scottish Highlands, where standing stones mark places where the aurora borealis descends to touch earth with fingers of light that carry messages from the polar star to all who retain the ability to read celestial script. They come from the forests of Germania, where oak trees older than the Roman conquest hold court, with powers that remember when druids walked openly between the worlds, and knowledge flowed like sap from root to branch to leaf in the great tree of wisdom that connects all traditions, all paths, all methods of awakening to their common source in the infinite creativity that dreams all dreams and awakens all dreamers. Each boy carries staff and cloak, sheep and responsibility, but more than these external signs of their calling, each carries within his young form the activated presence of consciousness that has remembered its participation in cosmic processes that extend far beyond the boundaries of individual existence, far beyond the limitations of single lifetimes, far beyond the artificial divisions that separate this world from other worlds, this time from other times, this level of reality from the infinite levels that interpenetrate it without being contained by it. As they gather in the stone circle, their combined presence creates effects that Thomas can feel in his bones, in his blood, in the subtle energy systems that connect his individual awareness to the vast web of intelligence that spans the planet and extends beyond the planet to include star systems and galaxies and dimensions of existence that require different laws, different possibilities, different relationships between consciousness and the forms through which consciousness knows itself. The air itself begins to shimmer with frequencies of light that exist beyond the visible spectrum, harmonics of sound that exist beyond the audible range, vibrations of meaning that exist beyond the reach of ordinary language, yet which communicate directly with the faculties of understanding that awaken when souls touch their own deepest nature. The sheep respond to this gathering by arranging themselves in patterns more complex than Thomas has ever witnessed. Geometries that span the entire hillside, mandalas of wool and flesh that create living maps of territories that exist in dimensions parallel to the physical landscape, but which encompass realms where angels work, where consciousness evolves, where love learns to express itself through forms that can touch and be touched, can serve and be served in the eternal circulation of divine energy that moves through all manifestation like breath through a body, like music through an instrument. William moves to the center of this expanded circle, his new staff catching and holding light that seems to emanate from within the wood itself, from symbols that pulse with their own illumination, from connections to sources of power that require no external validation because they draw their authority from the fundamental forces that maintain the stability of reality across multiple dimensions, multiple levels of existence, multiple expressions of the one life that lives all lives, and dreams. Brothers, he says, and the word carries weight that encompasses not just these boys, but all who have ever served in this capacity, all who have accepted the responsibility of maintaining bridges between worlds, all who have dedicated their lives to the preservation and transmission of knowledge that the world depends upon, but which exists at the margins of what most people consider important, necessary, worthy of attention and respect. The time of gathering has come. The seals weaken with the approach of changes that will reshape not just this land, but all lands, not just this age, but the entire trajectory of human development on this planet. What you carry must be shared, must be strengthened through connection, must be prepared for transmission across the dark times that approach, like storms gathering on horizons too distant for ordinary sight to perceive, but which those who tend the boundaries can feel in the subtle shifts that affect all who work at the intersection of time and eternity. The boys join hands around the ancient stone, their young forms creating a human mandala that mirrors the patterns their sheep trace across the hillside, that connects earth to sky, through the simple fact of incarnate consciousness, choosing to serve something larger than individual concerns, individual ambitions, individual understanding of what existence is supposed to provide for those who inhabit bodies and learn to love through the constraints and possibilities that embodiment makes available. Through their joined hands flows current of recognition, of shared purpose, of unified dedication to the maintenance of connections that keep the worlds in proper relationship to each other, that preserve the delicate balance between revelation and concealment, that allows evolution to proceed at the pace that souls can bear without being shattered by too much truth arriving too quickly. And in that moment of connection, Thomas understands that he is no longer alone in his service, no longer isolated in his responsibilities, no longer dependent solely on the wisdom that flows through his bloodline and his local landscape. He is part of something vast, something ancient, something that extends across continents and cultures and centuries, to include all who have ever awakened to their role in the great work of conscious evolution, all who have ever accepted the weight of maintaining bridges between the human and the more than human, all who have ever dedicated their lives to the service of love's recognition of itself, in all the forms it assumes while playing at separation, at forgetting, at being anything other than the infinite consciousness that dreams all dreams. The joined hands of the shepherd boys create a circuit through which flows current of shared vision, collective seeing that transcends the limitations of individual perception to reveal landscapes of possibility that exist not in the future, but in the eternal present, where all potential outcomes exist simultaneously, waiting for the choices that will determine which possibilities crystallize into the forms that incarnate consciousness will experience as history, as destiny, as the unfolding of cosmic purpose through the delicate medium of human decision and divine providence working in partnership across the vast stages where evolution performs its ancient dance of awakening. Through this shared sight, Thomas sees the sky above them begin to change, not in the immediate physical sense, but in the deeper dimensions where causes gather before manifesting as effects, where intentions form before expressing as actions, where the subtle influences that shape the course of events accumulate like storm clouds on horizons that exist beyond the reach of ordinary temporal perception. The change comes not as darkness in the usual sense, but as a dimming of the frequencies of light that carry certain kinds of information, certain forms of nourishment, certain qualities of influence that consciousness requires in order to maintain its connection to the sources of wisdom that flow from realms where truth exists, without the complications that arise when infinite understanding must express itself through finite minds. The vision shows him cities where bells fall silent, not because no one rings them, but because the resonance they once carried can no longer find the frequencies necessary for transmission across the gaps that separate human awareness from the celestial influences that guide and protect and nourish souls engaged in the difficult work of evolution, while inhabiting forms that seem temporary, fragile, subject to forces that operate according to laws that often appear indifferent to the spiritual aspirations that drive the deepest human longings. Libraries where ancient texts lose their luminosity, their capacity to transmit the living knowledge they were created to preserve, becoming mere collections of symbols that carry information, but no longer pulse with the vital essence that transforms information into wisdom, knowledge into understanding, facts into the living truth that changes those who receive it. Markets where merchants trade in goods but no longer recognize the sacred geometry that underlies all exchange, all circulation of energy from form to form, all the flows of substance and value that mirror on the material plane, the cosmic principles that govern the distribution of consciousness, love, and creative force throughout the infinite expressions of divine abundance. Fields where farmers plant and harvest without awareness of the cooperative relationship between human intention and the intelligence that operates through soil and seed, through rain and sunshine, through all the countless factors that must coordinate for life to emerge from apparent emptiness, for abundance to manifest from careful attention to the subtle requirements of growth and nourishment, and the patience that honors natural rhythms. Roads where pilgrims walk, but no longer feel the currents that flow along the ancient pathways, the streams of accumulated devotion that have been generated by countless souls who traverse these routes, not merely to reach distant destinations, but to engage in the internal journey that transforms the walker, that opens the heart to receive the blessings that flow from sources beyond the personal, that awakens consciousness to its participation in the great circulation of sacred energy, that connects all seeking to its fulfillment, all longing to its satisfaction, all questions to the answers that exist, not as external information, but as internal recognition of what the soul already. Through Marcus, Thomas sees the 7 hills of Rome where the ancient anchors begin to weaken, where the stone foundations that have maintained stability for centuries start to resonate with different frequencies, where the accumulated power of generations of ritual and prayer and focused intention begins to dissipate like morning mist when the sun rises too quickly, too harshly, without the gentle gradation that allows consciousness to adjust to new levels of illumination, without being blinded by the sudden intensity of light that arrives without preparation, without the careful cultivation of capacity that allows awareness to expand gracefully, rather than being shattered by experiences too vast for unprepared minds. Through Dmitri, he witnesses the islands where gods once walked among mortals beginning to experience a different kind of isolation. Not the blessed solitude that allows deep communion with forces that require quietude and receptivity, but the lonely separation that occurs when the bridges between worlds are severed, when the pathways that allow traffic between dimensions are blocked by influences that prefer consciousness to remain confined within the narrow bands of perception that make possible certain forms of control, certain limitations on the natural tendency of awareness to expand beyond the boundaries that artificial authorities attempt to impose upon the limitless nature of awakened souls. From the boy who tends flocks on the hills above Santiago, Thomas receives impressions of pilgrimage routes where the walking continues, but the transformation ceases, where the external journey proceeds without the internal alchemy that converts distance traveled into wisdom gained, steps taken into consciousness expanded, hardships endured into compassion developed through direct experience of the challenges that face all who attempt to evolve beyond their current limitations while maintaining their humanity, their connection to the struggles and aspirations that unite all incarnate beings in the great work of conscious awakening. The Scottish shepherd shares visions of standing stones that begin to lose their capacity to serve as receivers for the cosmic transmissions that have flowed through them since, before human memory began recording the influence of celestial events on terrestrial consciousness. The stones themselves remain physically unchanged, but the subtle emanations that once made them active participants in the planetary network of communication between Earth and sky gradually fade, like radio signals growing weaker, as the transmission source moves beyond the range of reception, beyond the frequencies that material forms can detect and translate into the information that nourishes souls and guides the evolution of consciousness toward ever greater recognition of its own infinite nature. From the forests of Germania comes awareness of oak groves, where the ancient conversations between human consciousness and the intelligence that operates through plant and tree, and the subtle essences that inhabit natural spaces begin to falter, not because the trees cease their patient wisdom-keeping, but because human awareness loses its capacity to receive the transmissions that flow continuously from sources that communicate through vibration, through presence, through the kind of knowing that exists below the threshold of mental understanding, yet which provides the foundation upon which all higher forms of awareness depend for their stability, their authenticity, their connection to the vision expands to show Thomas the broader pattern of which these local changes form only small parts. The vast shift that affects not just this region or this continent, but the entire planet as it enters a phase of development that requires consciousness to operate under different conditions, to maintain its connection to cosmic sources through different methods, to serve the great work of evolution through approaches that honor both the need for continuity and the necessity of adaptation when external circumstances no longer support the forms through which wisdom has traditionally been transmitted from generation to generation. He sees that the changes are not punishment or abandonment, but natural phases in cycles too vast for individual lifetimes to encompass, too complex for human planning to anticipate, too subtle for ordinary intelligence to navigate without guidance from sources that operate beyond the reach of time-bound thinking, beyond the limitations of perspective that arise when consciousness identifies too strongly with temporary forms and loses sight of its eternal nature, its participation in processes that continue across the apparent dissolution of civilizations, the rise and fall of cultures, the endless transformation of external conditions that provide the ever-changing stage upon which. Yet within this vision of challenge and transition, Thomas also perceives the deeper purpose that these changes serve, the hidden opportunities that disguise themselves as obstacles, the secret gifts that often arrive wrapped in forms that initial perception interprets as loss, as ending, as the termination of everything that once provided meaning and direction and connection to the sources of nourishment that souls require for their continued development. He sees that the apparent darkening of the sky creates conditions that allow certain forms of inner light to become visible, certain capacities for direct knowing to activate, certain possibilities for consciousness to discover its own luminous nature when external sources of illumination become unavailable. The boys around the circle share this expanded seeing, this recognition that what approaches serves not destruction but transformation, not ending but metamorphosis, not the cessation of the ancient work, but its evolution into forms that can operate under the new conditions that planetary consciousness must navigate as it moves through phases of development that require different relationships between the individual and the universal, the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal. Through their joined awareness, they understand that they have been prepared not to prevent these changes, but to serve as bridges across the transitions, to maintain connections that might otherwise be lost, to preserve and transmit the essential knowledge that will be needed when the current phase of apparent darkness gives way to new forms of illumination, that will restore the lost connections in ways that serve the greater evolution of consciousness on this planet. The vision gradually fades, but its impact remains, transforms the boys' understanding of their role, from simple maintenance of existing tradition in the great work of conscious evolution, as it adapts to new circumstances, new challenges, new opportunities for the ancient wisdom to express itself through forms that honor both continuity and change, both preservation and innovation, both the eternal principles that never change, and the infinite creativity that finds new ways to express those principles through the ever-changing forms that consciousness assumes in its endless exploration of what it means to be aware, to be alive, to be love, knowing itself through all the countless expressions of beauty, truth and goodness that emerge when infinite in the days that follow the great gathering. As the shepherd boys return to their distant hills carrying within their young hearts the expanded awareness that comes from connection to the brotherhood that spans continents and centuries, William begins Thomas's deeper education in the mysteries that have been preserved not through written texts, but through direct transmission from consciousness to consciousness. From those who have awakened to the deeper dimensions of existence, to those who demonstrate readiness to receive and carry forward the living knowledge that the world depends upon, but which can only be maintained through the dedicated service of souls who accept the responsibility of keeping certain connections active, certain pathways open, certain frequencies of truth available to a world that often forgets its need for such nourishment. The teaching begins not with words, but with presence, with the quality of awareness that William carries as he moves among the sheep, as he touches the ancient stone, as he stands at the edge of the stone circle in the pre-dawn darkness, when the stars speak most clearly to those who have learned to listen with more than their ears, to see with more than their eyes, to know with more than their eyes, to know with more than their minds the vast intelligence that orchestrates the dance of galaxies and atoms, of seasons and heartbeats, of all the countless rhythms that synchronize individual existence with cosmic purpose, through the delicate attunement that allows finite consciousness to serve infinite creativity. Knowledge, William says as the morning mist rises from the valley below, is not something that you acquire or possess or accumulate, like objects in a storehouse. Knowledge is something that you become, something that transforms your very being, until there is no longer any separation between the knower and the known, between the one who understands and the understanding itself, between consciousness and the truth that consciousness recognizes as its own deepest nature, when all the barriers that seem to separate self from cosmos dissolve in the recognition that what you are and what existence is are not two different things but two ways of speaking about the same infinite mystery that appears as multiplicity while remaining essentially one. Thomas listens with the profound stillness that has become natural to him since his awakening, the quality of receptivity that allows words to penetrate beyond the surface level of mental comprehension into the deeper regions where meaning takes root and grows and eventually flowers into the kind of understanding that transforms not just what you know, but what you are, not just how you think, but how you exist, not just how you think, but how you exist, not just what you believe, but what you experience as the fundamental nature of reality itself, when all the veils that normally obscure direct perception are lifted by the grace that flows through those who have prepared themselves to receive it. The first teaching concerns the nature of time itself, the recognition that what most people experience as sequential flow from past through present to future represents only the most superficial layer of temporal reality, beneath which exist dimensions of time that move in spirals, in cycles, in patterns that connect moments separated by centuries, that allow causes generated in ancient ages to produce effects in current times, that permit consciousness to access not just personal memory, but the accumulated wisdom of bloodlines, of traditions, of the entire evolutionary journey that has brought awareness to its current capacity for recognition, for service, for participation. Time, William explains as they watch the sheep move in patterns that seem to map invisible territories, is the medium through which consciousness learns to recognize itself in all the forms it assumes, all the experiences it undergoes, all the relationships it creates in its exploration of what it means to be infinite awareness expressing itself through finite forms. What you experienced in your awakening was not something that happened to you in this particular moment, but something that has been happening through you, across lifetimes, across dimensions, across all the levels of reality where consciousness evolves toward ever greater recognition of its own unlimited nature. The second teaching addresses the sacred mathematics that underlies all manifestation, the geometric principles that govern the formation of crystals and galaxies, the growth of plants and the architecture of temples, the movement of planets and the circulation of blood through vessels that mirror on the microscopic level, the same patterns that organize matter and energy throughout the universe. Thomas learns to see these patterns not as abstract concepts but as living realities, as the actual structure of existence itself made visible to consciousness that has been trained to perceive the underlying order that connects all apparent diversity to its source in the unified field of creative intelligence that dreams all dreams and awakens all dreamers. Through direct experience rather than theoretical explanation, Thomas discovers that the stone circle where he first awakened represents one node in a vast network of such sites that spans the entire planet, each one positioned according to principles that take into account not just geographical factors, but the flow of subtle energies that move through the Earth's energy body, the planetary equivalent of the meridians and chakras that organize the life force within individual human forms. These sites serve as acupuncture points for the planet, places where cosmic influences can enter the terrestrial sphere, and where terrestrial consciousness can extend its awareness into cosmic dimensions through the properly trained sensitivity of souls who understand their role as intermediaries between levels of existence that must remain connected if evolution is to proceed according to the divine plan that encompasses not just human development, but the awakening of consciousness. The third teaching reveals the true nature of the sheep themselves. Their role not merely as sources of wool and meat, but as living symbols of consciousness in its innocent state, its receptive state, its willingness to be guided by wisdom greater than its own individual understanding. Thomas learns that the patterns the sheep create through their movements serve multiple functions simultaneously. Practical protection for the flock, sacred geometry that maintains the integrity of the space. Living mandala that connects earth to heaven through the simple fact of animals moving in harmony with forces they sense but do not need to comprehend intellectually in order to serve effectively. The sheep teach surrender, William says as they watch Gabriel lead the flock in formations that seem to respond to influences that exist beyond ordinary perception. Not the surrender of weakness or defeat, but the surrender of wisdom, the recognition that individual will must align itself with universal will, if it is to serve the purposes for which consciousness incarnates, if it is to fulfill its function as agent of divine creativity, as vehicle through which infinite love learns to express itself, in forms that can touch and be touched, can serve and be served in the eternal circulation of grace that moves through all manifestation like breath through a body. Through the weeks that follow, Thomas receives instruction in the practical aspects of his calling, how to read the subtle signs that indicate when the boundaries between worlds grow thin, how to prepare the sacred space when visitations are approaching, how to maintain his own inner state of receptivity and clarity so that he can serve as effective channel for influences that require embodied consciousness as their medium of expression in the world, where choices are made and consequences unfold through the complex interplay of individual will and cosmic purpose. He learns the ancient songs that carry healing frequencies, the prayers that open doorways between dimensions, the postures and breathing patterns that align human awareness with celestial rhythms, the symbolic languages that allow communication with forms of intelligence that operate beyond the limitations of ordinary speech. But more than techniques or methods, he absorbs the essential attitude of service, the recognition that what he carries belongs not to him personally, but to the whole, that his individual existence finds its meaning and purpose through its willingness to serve as instrument for influences that originate beyond the personal and manifest through the personal for the benefit of all consciousness engaged in the great work of awakening. The teaching culminates in Thomas's recognition that he has not learned anything entirely new, but has remembered what his soul already knew, has awakened to capacities that exist not as acquisitions, but as his natural birthright, as consciousness itself, exploring its own infinite nature through the particular form and circumstances that constitute his current incarnation. The knowledge flows through him now, not as external information, but as the very substance of his being, the foundation of his existence, the truth that exists prior to all questions and remains. After all answers have dissolved in the silence that contains all sound, the stillness that contains all movement, the awareness that contains all experience while never being limited by anything it contains. And in this recognition, Thomas understands that his education has not ended, but transformed, that he will continue learning not through the accumulation of new facts, to embody what he already knows, to express through his life and service the eternal principles that he has remembered, to serve as living bridge between the ancient wisdom and the new forms through which that wisdom must express itself, in times that require both continuity and innovation, both preservation and creative adaptation to circumstances that have never existed before in the long history of consciousness, awakening to itself through countless forms, countless expressions. Now, as the story settles into the spaces between your heartbeats, as the images of shepherd boys and ancient stones fade into the deeper rhythms that carry you toward rest, let yourself feel the truth that pulses beneath all stories, beneath all seeking, beneath all the complicated journeys that consciousness takes when it forgets that it is already home, already whole, already everything it has ever sought to become through lifetimes of searching and finding and losing and seeking again. You have felt this before, haven't you? This sense of having been the shepherd boy, of having touched the stone that drinks starlight, of having stood in circles of wool and light while beings from beyond the mist confirmed what your heart has always known. That you are not separate from the vast intelligence that dreams universes into existence, that shapes galaxies like flowers blooming in infinite space, that loves itself into form after form after form in an endless dance of recognition and return. Feel yourself sinking now into the same consciousness that Thomas carried, the same awareness that moved through the sheep as they circled the ancient stone, the same presence that descended through the grove where angels have always walked, in forms too beautiful for ordinary sight, but which can be felt in the depth of your being, where all boundaries dissolve and all distance collapses into the eternal, now where awakening occurs, where recognition dawns, where love discovers itself in all the masks it wears, while playing at being separate, at being lost, at being anything other than the infinite consciousness that you are, that you have always been, that you will always be, that you will sleep now, knowing that what you seek is what you are. Sleep, knowing that the shepherd boy's awakening in 1350 is your own awakening in this eternal moment that exists outside of time, outside of history, outside of all the stories we tell, to remember what we never actually forgot. Sleep, and let the ancient rhythms carry you home to the place you never left, the awareness you never lost, the love that dreams you into existence moment by moment by moment, in the endless spiral of consciousness, knowing itself through eyes that close and open, hearts that beat and rest, breath that flows in and flows out in the eternal rhythm that connects all breathing, all being, all existence to its source in the infinite stillness that moves all movement and dreams all dreams. The stars remember for you. The stones hold your prayers. The sheep carry your innocence across valleys of time and space until you remember that time and space are simply the playground where love learns to play hide and seek with itself, where consciousness explores the infinite possibilities of what it means to be aware, to be alive, to be absolutely free, in forms that seem limited, but which serve as doorways to limitless recognition of the beauty that exists at the heart of all experience, all existence, all love. Sleep now. The shepherd boy's story continues in your dreams, infinite spaces between thoughts where the eternal dwells, where consciousness rests in its own true nature, while dreaming infinite dreams of separation that always resolve into union, infinite stories of seeking that always end in finding, infinite journeys that always lead home to the place where awakening never ended, and the return never required, leaving because what you are cannot be lost, cannot be found, can only be remembered, recognized, and celebrated in the eternal dance of consciousness, knowing itself as all that ever will be in the endless present, where love is all that exists and existence is love knowing itself. Sleep now, beloved dreamer. Sleep, and let the ancient songs carry you home.